On today's World Insight, a creeping U.S. Cold War mentality, the source of a rift with partners like China. What are the chances of a rapprochement under a Biden administration? And up close with Emmanuelle Charpentier, the 2020 Nobel laureate in chemistry, credited for laying the foundation of groundbreaking gene editing. Her thoughts on COVID-19 and breaking the glass ceiling as a top female scientist. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The United States was on a roll in the past 4 years, going it along with trade wars, withdrawal from international deals and multilateral institutions, and flat out dodging cooperation, even in a time of worsening pandemic. The clear message from the American First, the U.S. administration was it's our way or the highway. It's reminiscent of the Cold War when the mentality was, if you're not with us, you're against us. Now, how well entrenched is this mentality in American politics today? Is that legacy, quote unquote, here to stay? Or could the incoming Biden administration steer the U.S. on a more even keel? What about the China-U.S. relations and its potential? Let's ask our strong panel. For more on the latest, we are joined in Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, Professor and Director at Nuclear Studies Institute from American University. And joining us in Boston, Robert Ross, Associate from John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Last but not least, in Shanghai, XINBO, Director of the Center for American Studies. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program. Now, there's already electoral vote, so it seems that the things are already being confirmed. Professor, Mr. Ross.
Yes, the electors have chosen Joseph Biden as president, and since then, the leader of the Senate has confirmed that Joseph Biden will be our next president. So much of the uncertainty over Donald Trump has been diminished, and many of us look forward to a new president on January 20th.
Mr. President-elect Biden suggests the accusations toward him and his campaign by the current administration, President Trump particularly, has been unconscionable. Mr. Kuznick, how many people do you think he's representing when he made such statements?
According to the polls, almost 80% of Trump voters think the election was a fraud and that it was stolen from Trump, that Trump actually won. So we've got a very large number of Americans who are divorced from reality, and they are supporting a president who has reverted increasingly toward fascism. The Republican Party is not a traditional party anymore. It's turning slowly into a fascistic death cult that has ignored the coronavirus, that has had magical solutions, that has not acted, while 300,000 Americans have officially died.
Yeah.
But many experts say that's only a fraction of the numbers who have actually died. And yet they have done nothing about this.
Mr. Ross, given what you both have just said, so how much can we expect the president-elect after January the 20th be able to implement the three priorities that he has been set about the pandemic, about the vaccines, and providing urgent support to those in need as a result of the impact of the pandemic on the economy?
Well, I think the biggest change is we'll now have a president who is focused on the pandemic and bringing relief to the American people. He will be on top of the situation. He will have good leadership. He has hired good people, and it will be a priority. He has said he will call in the Defense Industrial Act to make sure things are done quicker. So as we all know, many of the deaths in America, over 300,000, many of them, most of them, were unnecessary if we had good leadership. So now that we'll have a president who doesn't deny the existence of the pandemic, who doesn't call it a fraud, but is focused on dealing and treating people, we should be able to make far more rapid progress in eradicating the deaths, in dealing with the disease, and restoring our economy.
Professor Wu, what is your judgment, given your experience of decades being a China-U.S. relations expert, looking at the U.S. today?
I think today the United States is kind of like in a wartime. Basically, the social life has been disrupted, and as I just chatted with Professor Ross, they have been teaching online for almost 1 year. While in China, actually, for this fall semester, the students all returned to campus. I think this is a very rare, unprecedented situation, not just because of the pandemic, but also more importantly, as Bob Ross mentioned, the lack of strong and capable leadership. The country just lose its direction, and people lose confidence about where the country is going. And the people outside of the United States, they just feel like the United States is beyond recognition. It's no longer the United States people in the world are familiar with. So this year is a particular year for the world as well, but for the United States is really, really a very unfortunate year.
Of course, we will need some more years or probably recent history to reflect upon in order to understand what kinds of period is U.S. going through right now, years from now, I guess. But for now, let me focus on some specifics. When the president-elect comes into office January the 20th, he's already facing a huge agenda, earlier priorities about the pandemic vaccine and also economic urgent supply toward those in need are already quite ambitious plan given the circumstances. But on the other fronts, also, for example, about international governance and also international relations. Now, Mr. Kuznick, Professor, go to your expertise about the nuclear issue. Iran leader have already claimed very clearly if the U.S. returns to the Iran deal, the Iran would also 100% come back to that deal. Now, will the president-elect be able to, at this time with so many priorities struggling, come back, bring the U.S. back?
The first priority when it comes to nuclear issues is the New START treaty with Russia. Biden will only have 2 weeks to extend the New START treaty. If the New START treaty is allowed to evaporate, then we're going to be heading toward a new nuclear arms race. The second thing is we still got 33 or 34 days of the Trump administration, and Trump's behavior toward Iran, which you mentioned, is very, very provocative. There are many who fear that Trump is trying to provoke a military confrontation with Iran before he's out of office. Assuming that we can get through the next month safely without a military confrontation, then we do need to restore the JCPOA. Biden has said he is willing to restore the Iran nuclear deal. That's in everybody's interest. It was working very, very effectively. China was part of that agreement, as was Russia, and hopefully Biden will be able to do that. There will be some opposition. In the Middle East, for example, we've got Israel, we've got Saudi Arabia, we've got the United Arab Emirates, who are very hostile to Iran and do not want to see the United States return to that. But I think that enough wise people in the administration, Biden's advisors, have all been very good on this issue. And they were the ones who helped create the JCPOA during the Obama administration. So I think that will be a priority.
Professor Wu, your take.
I think on the front of international relations, Biden will do several things. First and foremost, he will return to the climate change, the Paris Agreement. That's the first priority for him. And second, I agree with Peter that returning to Iran nuclear is also a big issue for him on the agenda, not just because that's an important part of Obama-Biden legacy, but also because it has a lot to do with the peace and stability in the Middle East. And the third thing is really how to manage relations with China. I think the Trump administration is still working on building more stumbling blocks for Biden on China. Every day, this administration is coming up with more sanctions, punishments on China, so that they will make it difficult for Biden to clear up the house. So there's still 1 month to go. Who knows what will happen? Something in South China Sea, in Taiwan Strait. You don't know what this kind of crazy people they are going to do. So I think this is a big challenge for the Biden administration on international front. It's as difficult as the domestic front.
I see. Mr. Ross, you've been a long-time observer of China and U.S.-China relations. Your take?
We see an administration, I believe, that wants to leave the Biden administration with an irreversible Cold War. We have this economic Cold War, a technology Cold War, and a Taiwan Cold War, an arms race in the South China Sea, and he wants to lock this in with ideological speeches and policies that will make it very difficult for the Biden administration to reverse. I think for 2 reasons. One, the domestic politics. It will be difficult to begin to reverse the economic policies because it will suggest to the opposition that he's weak on China, or that he wants to go back to where we were before. And so many of these things need to be done gradually with reciprocity. This is particularly the case with the trade war. And so the second issue is not just domestic politics, but in the last 4 years, to be frank, China's done quite well compared to the United States. Their situation on the Korean Peninsula has been improving. Their trade situation has been improving. In the South China Sea, the Chinese are doing better. And even in Europe, with the One Belt, One Road, they're winning friends. So it's not clear to me that the Chinese are going to help the United States in improving the international situation of the Biden administration. Negotiations may be far harder than they were before, because China may feel they're holding a very strong hand. So given American domestic politics and the developments in the bilateral relationship, it may be very hard to reverse the current trend.
On the other hand, Mr. Ross, here from this part of the world, people wonder whether the Biden administration would like to have a free ride as a result of the last few weeks of what Trump administration is trying to do toward China, and therefore providing more, shall I say, excuses, if not reasons, to not improve relations with China at the very beginning of the administration.
I think the Biden team, as well as President-elect Biden, have made clear that what they would like to happen is a compartmentalization of the relationship. That is, the United States and China will compete where we must, but we will also cooperate where we should. This is very different than the Trump administration had an all-of-government approach, a decoupling. So the Biden administration would like to cooperate on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, would like to cooperate in Iran, would like to cooperate on trade, climate change, global pandemics, international drug trafficking, a wide range of issues. And American interests and Chinese interests can only be developed through U.S.-China cooperation. But on competitive issues, say the South China Sea, or high-tech security issues, the United States will take measures to defend its interests. But that's called compartmentalization, not all-of-government approach. The difficulty for the Biden administration is moving there, step by step, when so much seems to have been locked in by the cold warriors in the Trump administration.
We noticed at the very beginning of the Biden administration, according to the current plan, is to go into a so-called international conference for democracies. One could tell, probably even from the name of it, that it is about seeking allies, particularly in an ideological form. And of course, obviously, China and the U.S. and some of the other democracies are not having the same kinds of political system. So, Professor Wu, how worried, as an expert on China-U.S. relations, are you about the common ground, particularly initial stage common ground China and the U.S. could actually show to one another?
Well, let's look at the Biden's major priorities: fighting COVID-19, recovering economy, and also dealing with climate change. So for all those major issues, China is an important partner to work with, not an enemy or even a competitor to deal with. So if Biden really takes his priorities seriously, he should view China as major partners in this regard. he should explain to the American audience that for the moment, the most urgent task for the United States is to deal with its domestic challenges, pandemic, economic recovery, racial tensions. China does not pose an imminent threat. China is not an existential threat to the United States. So if he can explain this very clearly to American audience, he can really change the atmosphere in which China-U.S. will engage with each other. On the Chinese side, we are ready to cooperate with the United States on a wide range of issues, from dealing with pandemic to mitigating climate change, to managing bilateral treaty issues, to stabilizing the Korean Peninsula, Afghanistan, and many other issues. So I think we really have a lot of common ground. What we need to do is really for the Biden administration, the new U.S. government, to acknowledge the need for cooperation with China and also to take a bold step in reach out to China. In that case, you really need to jump over the Trump trap, which really makes it difficult to cooperate with China.
Professor Kuznick, listening to your two colleagues now reminds me of an early conversation I had with some of the other experts on China-U.S. relations, that both wants the other side to take the first few steps and phrase it in a narrative that is about mending relations and also warming up relations. How do you think the two sides will be able to take parallel steps so that we could see the common ground at the very initial stage, which is important to set the tone?
I think deep down, Biden wants friendlier relations with China. Now, it's not going to be the kind of relationship like Trump would have with people, in which policy was not a major factor, and Trump would be deluded very easily in those kinds of situations. Biden's a little more sophisticated in that regard, but the reality is that we have common interests, and we're in a very dangerous world right now. Biden has to understand that the Trump policies, especially in the South China Sea, the freedom of navigation operations in the Strait of Taiwan, South China Sea, have been very, very dangerous. Biden will be, as my colleagues are saying, somewhat constrained by Trump's policies. And in terms of the policy priorities, the spending priorities, Biden is being somewhat boxed in by that. But hopefully Biden, who's not known for being a bold mover on policy, hopefully Biden will realize that he's got to break out of the box that he's been put into and reach out to China and not be so concerned about the pushback he's going to get, especially from the Republicans, but also from some people in his own party. I'm hoping that this is one of the places that Biden will see he can break definitively with Trump policy and do so very early on in the new administration.
I see. Professor Wu Xinbo, we have seen China over the past 1 year or so has been trying to work its way out of the current deadlock with the relations with the U.S. Recently, we've seen the signing of RCEP, even though the legal process going on within those economies will take about half or even 1 year to approve the RCEP and make it up and running. Meanwhile, you also see China trying to work on the innovation, particularly with the recent meeting for the preparation of the Central Work Conference. There has been a lot of talk of two keywords. Rather than earlier version, it was about reform and opening up. Now it's about reform and innovation. So, Professor Wu, how do you see China is on its own trying to clean its house and preparing for a new possibility with the United States, be it more difficult or be it more cooperative than over the past few years?
Well, I think over the last several years, Trump administration's China policy has served as a kind of a wake-up call for China to rethink about its development strategy. The first thing is that China has become more determined in pursuing indigenous technological innovation, reducing its reliance on the outside, especially on the United States. Secondly, I think China is also trying to boost its domestic consumption, relying more on domestic market rather than rely on exporting to other markets, including the United States. That's what we call the dual circulation development strategy. I think this is a long-term strategy. And thirdly, China is also trying to work with other countries other than the United States, with countries in East Asia, in Europe, to forge free trade agreement and bilateral investment treaty agreement, reducing the economic dependence on the United States. All this, what China has been doing is to reduce the vulnerability that resulting from over-reliance on the United States. So in that sense, I think China is gradually moving to a stronger position vis-a-vis the United States. Yes, look in the future, we still want to cooperate with the United States on many issues, bilaterally and multilaterally, but we also want to reduce the vulnerability, and we also want to have a plan B when if suddenly it rains. So I think that's what China is doing, and I think this will continue to do. To some extent, this is a new reality in China-U.S. relations for a long time to come.
We have been seeing cooperation from the other side, but over the past few years, it's different. It's not just different within the administration members, but also different among some who have been dealing with China-U.S. relations for long. Now, Mr. Ross, you and certainly Professor Kuznick are not belong to that category, but are you worried that, you know, the competition or whatever you name this relationship between China and the United States will go rationally or irrationally for years to come? Mr. Ross.
Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China's rise as a great power has been very rapid. And the results, whatever Chinese intentions were, the results have been eroding American alliances in East Asia and changing the balance of power. And that inevitably is going to create greater U.S.-China friction, tension, conflict. And that, to a large degree, is going to shape how we move forward. So XINBO says it was a wake-up call, and we do see the Chinese leadership moving to a more self-reliant system in the context of greater U.S.-China competition. But second, going to your point, this has shaped much of the American dialogue within Washington and how Americans interact with our Chinese colleagues. I have one close friend in Washington who, when she would go to China for many, many years, she would ask many questions and take many notes and try and learn from her Chinese colleagues about how China saw the world. She and now most of the people in Washington go to China and they lecture China. If you want better relations, you want to improve relations, this is what you need to do. And that is simply not a constructive way for the United States and China to establish a foundation for maximizing cooperation and maximizing stability and managing competition. We need to listen, as you were suggesting. How we see the world, how we understand the world. It will not be possible to go back to our prior situation, but conversations and dialogues and understanding make it possible to move forward in a more constructive way to manage the relationship, minimize unnecessary costs, reduce the likelihood of unnecessary tension and conflict. So I hope what you're saying doesn't become the norm.
Robert Ross, Peter Kuznick, last but not least, XINBO. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We hope it's going to be the one that makes sense going to prevail in the conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.